Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to be going over what's due in the next module. Specifically, it's what we call the data interpretation assignment. Now, this assignment is obviously highly dependent upon the last assignment that we had, where you were given the data and asked to run some analyses on them. Specifically, you were asked to figure out the descriptive statistics of your variables that you were interested in using that came from the Excel file I gave you. You were also asked to start to calculate what we call the inferential statistics. Those were your main effects, which was your correlation measure, your t statistic, f statistic, chi-squared statistic, whatever it is that you were running for your main analysis, which again, as we talked about in our last video, was highly dependent upon the types of variables where you were using. And you needed to also figure out your effect sizes, which talk about the magnitude of the effects that you were looking at, which was independent of the sample sizes that we were using for this study, which were intended to be relatively small. Obviously, you weren't using 50 data points. We were using, I think, a maximum of 10 data points per student in the class when they were trying to do their analysis. So our effect sizes really are a critical component to our research, with the assumption, obviously, that what we got from the data that we were hypothetically collecting, which of course was just made up data, was indicative of what the populations would be like. Lots of stuff to unravel with that. And this is actually going to be a big component to what we're going to be doing in this next assignment, where we're going to sort of be going beyond the data, not just saying, hey, I found this T statistic or I found this F statistic. It was statistically significant or statistically insignificant. But we're going to talk about how this fits into the grand scheme of your research idea that you had in the first place, and maybe why you came to some of the results that you came to. Obviously, this is again requiring you to have done the earlier assignments and, more importantly, done it well. So my guess is by the time I kind of get to this point where you're watching this video, I will have had lots of conversations with a number of you within the class, because being able to do that data analysis that we talked about before is a critical component to being able to move on and to actually do anything with this specific assignment. So, if history repeats itself, even though I'm recording this in advance, my guess is that I've been having a number of back and forths with students within the class, making sure that there's a comprehension of what it is they have with their data, how they can make specific types of calculations, where that brings them in terms of the next steps. Hopefully, that means that all of you, as you're watching this video, are settled in on what type of analyses you're doing and what you found in terms of your results. If you're there, then this section isn't too bad, because what you're going to be doing in the first component of this assignment is just reiterating what it was you found. So, what was your F statistic or T statistic? What was the effect size? What effect size were you looking at? Were you looking at an eta squared? Were you looking at a chi-squared? Lots of different options are there. Again, it all is dependent on the data that you have. And then you've gotten to that point where you found those results, you found those things, and you've been able to determine if you found something that's statistically significant or not. You're revisiting that in the first section, and then what you're going to be able to do in the next two sections is tie what you found to those lit reviews that you were working on earlier. So if you found something significant, what does that mean? How does that tie to what it is that you talked about in your introductions? If you didn't find statistical significance, what does that mean? In terms of relying on that data as being factual, where do we go from there? What we also want to do in this particular component is be able to talk about the strengths and shortcomings of your data. So we talked about a small sample size. What does that mean? What if there's a mismatch between your effect size and your statistical significance? If you say, "Yeah, my effect size measures suggest that this is a huge effect, they didn't find statistical significance," how can you describe that lack of overlap? tying in things like sample size, tying in things like high degrees of variability or low degrees of variability, depending upon the type of data that you've got. This is what I want you to include in these analyses components when you're trying to not only tie this to your results, the statistical ideas to your results, but to the other literature that you're covering. When you are tying it to the other literature that you're covering, I want you to provide context by actually listing specific studies and what they found and how that aligns with your work. So, in this one, you're going to not only reference those individuals that you've talked about before, but you're going to cite them and provide their resources in a reference page, just like you did before. This is going to be huge because as we get to the next section, what you're going to be doing with this data interpretation assignment essentially is use this for your discussion section later on. You'll have your results section from the data that you just talked about before. I guess number one would be part of your results section. And then those last two parts are going to be sort of the skeleton for your discussion section that you'll have in your final paper, which is honestly getting really close to being something that you're going to work on now that we've done most of the footwork by the time we're done with this component. We got a lot of lifting to do before we get there. Right? We've got to make sure that we understood these effects that we found, both the descriptive ones and the inferential statistics. We got to make sure that we have a really good understanding of what our results mean in terms of significance and applications. We got to be able to tie what it is we found to the other research that's out there. So again, make sure you put a lot of effort into this. Make sure you put a lot of thought into this. If you need to meet with tutors, if you need a refresher, a video on results, there's lots out there. But we have to be able to do this component of the assignment so we can be able to really work on the latter sections of the paper. So I wish you the best of luck with this. Do not dawdle on getting started because that will make this very overwhelming experience. But if you get started now, utilize those resources that you have at your disposal, and you've gotten to the point where I think you're good on the data analysis, then we really should be able to get through this component and be ready to turn our attention to that final paper, which is coming up pretty darn soon at this point. But for now, I'm going to bid you adieu. Wish you the best of luck with this, and say, as I always tend to do, hope to see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.